You're up against some really big names, right, in the industry. There's Kellogg's, Nestlé, and such large incumbents.
The intent is to become India's most trusted brand for health. Even if you look at breakfast cereal, if you look at the per capita consumption of developed markets like the UK, they consume 17 kilos of cereal per person, per capita, per annum.
When you think about a competitor like Kellogg's, for example, they do over 1,400 crores in revenue.
Your traditional sugary stuff, which is loaded with sugar, which might be highly processed, is actually coming down. That's a global trend that's happening and it's bound to catch up in India.
Heard a very fun story that Bill Clinton's Secret Service team actually investigated your factory before he could eat your muesli. What's the story behind that?
I think the challenge for marketeers a decade back was to get people to try.
Yeah.
Now today, thanks to social media, thanks to, just consumer mindset, people are willing to try new concepts. And I think that's great for food brands. And I think that's why you have to work really hard to stay relevant. The only reason Bagrry's exists is because as a brand, we've spent almost close to zero on marketing.
Zero on marketing? What would you say as a consumer brand you've done differently in terms of marketing, that without spending too much, you've been able to build a presence in consumers' minds?
2-3 key things, if I would say. The first has been...
Hello and welcome everyone to the India Opportunity Show. Today I have with me a fantastic guest, Mr. Aditya Bagri, who's leading India's health food revolution with his family business, Bagrry's, one of India's leading cereal and breakfast brand. It's already present across 70,000 retailers all across India, and they do over 300 crores in turnover. This is one of those rare consumer brand stories of India, which is completely bootstrapped and yet profitable. Bagrry's has transformed the humble grain of wheat into a symbol of trust and excellence. As the saying goes, गेहूं के हर दाने पर होती है मेहनत की कहानी. Today's episode will be a masterclass for anyone building a consumer brand in India today. Hope you enjoy watching. Just to give our audience a lay of the landscape, you're up against some really big names, right, in the industry, but you guys give them a really strong competition, if I can say so. There's Kellogg's, Nestlé, and such large incumbents, but Bagrry's has had such a phenomenal run and such a fantastic story. Why don't we start with how you look at the lay of the landscape and the market size of the opportunity in India today?
You've been very kind with your words and thank you so much for that. But we've been a very small, homegrown sort of, brand which was started more out of passions. And my father, who started this, was very keen to put something of his own on the shelf, which was very clean label and honest. So I think today when we look at our vision, I think it's that passion which continues in everything we do. And the intent is to become India's most trusted, brand for health. And that space is a little larger than the breakfast space or, a specific subcategory that one might operate in. And the idea is to actually garner the trust of the consumers that if it's coming from Bagrry's, you can trust that it's clean label, it's healthy, it's made with some really high quality ingredients sourced from wherever, the best sources of the world might be. But if you look at categories like breakfast, for example, it's still at early stages as far as Western breakfast is concerned. And that's for, right reasons. We have very good ethnic breakfast options. We have poha, we have upma, we have, paratha in the south, we have, traditional South Indian options, and those are here to stay. And of course, even with, generations evolving, I think facets of convenience are definitely changing. But even if you look at breakfast cereal, if I look at the per capita consumption of developed markets like the UK, then they consume 17 kilos of cereal per person, per capita, per annum. India is probably an infinitesimal, point in that entire ecosystem. And this
what would it be in India if you were to?
I think it would be way sub of 1 kg because the category is actually right now not penetrated as deeply. It's not even a 10% penetration. And I think the key is that each subcategory has now got its own novelty. So we make oats, which is probably the most closely associated product in India because it's a hot porridge.
Yeah.
And then we've got mueslis, which is a more mass premium, semi-urban, phenomena, which is also increasingly getting traction in tier 2s, but it's a ready-to-eat, very convenient, health on-the-go kind of, breakfast concept. So each of these now have their own nuances and journeys in terms of what they offer. And I think globally, what's also happened is that the growth of breakfast cereals overall is muted, but stuff which is healthy. So your rolled oats, steel cut oats. There are brands coming up with new ideas, novel ingredients which are clean label or very functional, which might be high on protein and fiber, and those are actually growing, and those are actually breaking out of the clutter. And your traditional sugary stuff, which is loaded with sugar, which might be highly processed, is actually coming down. And that's a global trend that's happening, and it's bound to, catch up in India. The other challenge is that people are looking for convenience. So outside of India, the biggest challenge is people don't have time to pour milk into a bowl of breakfast cereal.
Really? Okay.
So I think as a country, we are far from that. But in India also, I think convenience, and especially with the advent of quick commerce, I think getting something which is healthy, convenient, and wholesome at the same time, and stuff that you can trust, labels that you can back, quality that you can trust. I think the combination of that is here to stay. And over the last decade, I've seen that people's willingness to try new stuff has increased disproportionately. Like, people today are happy to try new food concepts. And as someone who's been in the food processing space for a few years, I think the challenge for marketeers a decade back was to get people to try it. Now today, thanks to social media, thanks to, just consumer mindset, people are willing to try new concepts. And I think that's great for food brands. And I think that's why you have to work really hard to stay relevant.
And when you think about a competitor like Kellogg's, for example, they do over 1,400 crores in revenue. At least that's the number that I could see. But what is the other competition that you look at? Or how do you view competition? Like, are you competing with these giants, or are you competing with the newer challenger brands that are coming up? Because there are so many startups also trying to get into this space.
So when I look at the category, I still feel that it is one of the smaller categories with a long way to go, like I mentioned, in terms of the per capita opportunity. In contrast to, what one might believe, as stakeholders in the category, we need the category to grow. So I would even want our competitors to be able to do well, because that's where your per capita consumption is going up. That's where, there is also a journey of acquisition of consumers from traditional breakfast into breakfast cereal. Now that's a part of the journey which is category creation, and those have to be done by folks who are sitting on 60-70% share, where you tell people that, okay, this is why you should have breakfast cereal. At Bagrry's, we are very clear that our role predominantly is to talk about why Bagrry's, what makes us unique, what are our differentiators, be it the quality of ingredients, be it our health positioning, be it clean label, be it, the effort that goes into manufacturing, be it the legacy or the trust built over the years. So those are aspects which we talk about. And I think in general, the more play that's happened, I think there's been more innovation and experimentation. Now, categories of breakfast, you can create an infinite number of possibilities of, recipes and ideas and concepts. And some of those have stuck around and scaled up. Some of those have, fizzled out. And that's a natural phenomena. And, we are happy to be a part of that journey. We do view competition as a subcategory level benchmark that we have. Like, we'll have a different benchmark for a category of oats, for a category of cornflakes, for muesli, and it might vary by geography also. But I think the idea really is to, measure our yardstick, because many of these brands, especially the larger ones, have a larger distribution network than we have. They might have, more channels that are open than we are. So in our journey, we are obviously measuring our yardstick in the same stores that we are present in. And as our numeric distribution increases, so does our overall share.
Can you help me quantify, oats as a category, muesli as a category, just so, we have some numbers for our audience?
So I think if I come to oats, oats is definitely one of the larger, subcategories of breakfast cereal. If we view breakfast cereal as, say, a 3,000 crore market in India, where oats would, I think, be close to about 800 to 1,000 crore opportunity, especially with the value-added, oats play coming up. Kids is another big subsegment, and I think the largest in for several brands. And I think that itself is another, 500-600 crore opportunity. And then we've got muesli, which is a fast-growing, novelty that exists, which is what we've driven, and that's again a 500 crore plus, opportunity. And then you've got cornflakes and the others. So this is a guesstimate of the market. It could be, from direct data that you have from sources, as well as from what we see in the market. But this is fast evolving.
Yeah.
Also, what's happening is, over the years, categories such as muesli are taking away share from categories such as cornflakes.
Yeah.
As consumers are evolving, they obviously want more in that same bowl of breakfast cereal. So that's a natural evolution that's happening. So the overall pie may not necessarily increase, but people's preferences might shift from A to B.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, there's so much more consumer awareness around food habits and health and wellness, especially after the pandemic and having survived the pandemic, I would say. There's a growing awareness amongst consumers, and everyone wants protein-rich alternatives for everything. But I guess you guys were the first players in muesli. And you sort of created that category to a point where I read a funny story also that it was actually mistaken for something else at the start. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so actually, if I talk about muesli, so we started out, if I talk about our origins, we actually started out with a product called Wheat Bran.
Right.
And the background to that is that our family was in grain milling for a very long period of time. And my father, in his teenage years, had read a series of books by Mahatma Gandhi, and in that there was India of My Dreams, which clearly spoke about the nutritive values of wheat bran. Now, wheat bran is the byproduct of wheat and flour milling, which is choker, which is the outer layer of the wheat grain. Now, and that's a very nutritious part of the grain because it's got fiber and it's got great macronutrition, but it's unstable and it goes rancid, and that's why it's thrown away as cattle feed. So Gandhiji spoke about the fact that the most nutritive part of the grain is actually the outer layer, which is being thrown away. Right. So that stuck with him when he entered a family business of flour milling, and when he entered, he was 19. So after he established his understanding of grain milling and he established a flour mill unit by himself, he wanted to actually create something with wheat bran, because Gandhiji ne bola tha that bran is the healthiest part of the grain, but it was unstable. So he created a process in-house to stabilize it. Consumers wrote back letters saying that it was helping with their lipid profile coming under control. It was helping with reducing blood cholesterol levels. They felt digestion was better. People actually lost weight. And I think that gave us a lot of motivation to do more. So we launched oats, and which was again a grain which is Western to India. So we started processing that from scratch. So we created an in-house process to process oats, because in the early 90s, you could not import machinery. Neither did we have the capital on, oat processing for a category that did not exist. So we learned oat milling from scratch, which was technologically a lot of effort. And at that, back in the day, there was licenses. So we had a license to set up a unit in Delhi, but at that point of time, no one in family could readily put capital behind a 19-year-old kid. And the joint family had flour mill units across the country. So he said, okay, don't give me capital, give me any spare equipment you might have lying around. And he actually got spare equipment from different parts of the country, all which were not supposed to work with each other.
Wow.
He spent time under the machines for that 1 year. And he said that I used to go in, dressed and come back out white. And I had to balance lines with car jacks back in the early 70s to actually get things to work. And eventually, when he ran the line for the first time, it broke down, but he didn't give up. And he turned that around into one of the most profitable units for the family by the time he was 20. So that gave him a lot of confidence.
In just 1 year?
In 1 year.
Wow.
1 year. In Delhi.
What did he do differently?
He just set up a line, and he made sure that the capex was obviously close to zero, because he taken equipment which was not of value to the family in other units.
So this was different to what your family business was
doing, and this was something, in that sense, that's why I consider myself a second gen, because he himself created something from scratch.
Yeah.
Then we came across muesli. So I do ask him a lot of times that how did muesli happen? Because, you didn't have the internet. So how do you know what's healthy, what's not? So he said,
how is he finding out about these things?
So he read a lot of books. He got a lot of
the old school way.
So the old school way, he read a lot of books. Researched up on the fact that muesli actually is derived from the German word mus, which means mixture. And essentially, there was research to believe that people in the German-Swiss bordering areas had this breakfast meal, which was a mix of whole grain, oats, nuts, berries, seeds, and honey, and yogurt, which was essentially what was helping them, fuel energy through the day, live healthier, live longer. And then there was Dr. Max Bircher who researched up on it and created a first commercial recipe for the muesli. So
this must have been predating the time where complex carbohydrates were
Yeah.
recommended by doctors and
there was an entire 70s boom around muesli as a concept in
Right.
Europe. So
Okay.
muesli is a very European concept,
Yeah.
and you have granola, which is a very American concept
Yeah.
in that sense. So that was something he'd read up on. So he was very fascinated to create muesli, which was great. And then we'd had cornflakes just launched in India at the same time, and that and you can read up more on it, was not a very successful early journey, because I think what marketers missed was that India is a hot milk market,
Yeah.
and cornflakes go soggy as soon as you have hot milk. But muesli worked beautifully in hot milk because it had dry fruit, it had that hint of sweetness, it had honey, it had oats was a more resilient grain. Even when it did go soggy, it tasted better.
Yeah.
So I think the response we got was very encouraging, and for the first decade or so, it was just a passion project, and then eventually it transformed into a proper business in the early 2000s. So I think it was just something driven out of passion more than anything else, and we had distribution that literally started by a few stores in Delhi NCR, and eventually we went city to city, store to store.
Yeah,
and
talk
then
about
expanded
that journey
distribution.
also, because in today's consumer world, people don't even understand how retail networks or distribution networks were built, right? The old school way.
Yeah.
Because now the conversation is build your brand online till a certain
Yeah.
extent and then go offline. But by then, people don't really capitalize on this knowledge of building an offline distribution network.
So to be fair, I've been a big believer in omni-channel distribution,
Yeah.
because one of the first mandates that I was given when I joined the business, slightly over a decade back, was to actually build out our distribution network. So the challenge at that point of time that my father had thrown at me wasn't that there's a lot of competition that's come in or large multinationals have entered the space. He simply said, I'm getting phone calls that the product's not available on various shelves, and we need to fix that first, because there are consumers who want us and they may not have access to us. So I think he started his journey from manufacturing and I started my journey from distribution. But to be honest, because in the 90s we had to start out offline, we'd already built an offline distribution because that was the only way life was. And I think it's a far more complex structure in India than in the West.
Yeah.
So in the UK, where you could tie up with 4 or 5 large retailers, if you do Waitrose, if you do Sainsbury's, if you do Tesco, Asda, you're pretty much sorted in terms of covering the major market.
Yeah.
Out here, you have to go store to store, kirana to kirana, knock on those doors, convince them to buy your product, service and make sure that your product's delivered to them the next day, and understand if the offtake has happened and what's working, what's moving. So I think distribution in India is a far more complex challenge than many parts of the world, and that's actually what's kept many brands from entering the entire market of India. And I think from that perspective, we've seen a lot of regional play. So that's why a lot of regional brands have emerged, which are stronger in one geography, because solving for distribution plus diverse consumer taste is very hard. But that's something which we understood very early on, that requires multiple lenses. You have to get the right infrastructure in place, identify who's going to buy your product. So at the end of the entire funnel is the fact that you have to identify who's your target consumer.
Yeah.
You choose your stores, you choose your geographies, basis that. Then you invest into team and infrastructure, which is your frontline salespeople, get partners on board, which are distributors or channel partners, get the logistics in order, ensure that there's freshness of stock, moving in. So it's not rocket science. It's actually, some very basic brass tacks that one must follow. And eventually building an offline distribution is running a mini army unit. It is very disciplined. It's a very, day in, day out sort of a role where one has to work really hard. And if you've done sales beats, you have to do 30 to 40 calls a day, in some cases 50 calls a day in dense markets. And there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of presentation, there's a lot of groundwork. You have to go and clean the shelves yourself. I've had.
And did you have to do that?
So I did put myself through, some of that. I had to design like an orientation plan for myself because the family business actually was B2B, and we were pivoting to B2C when we had joined. So the mindset was still a lot B2B. And to be fair, I've done beats. I do like going to the market. I think there's no other solution for it, and you have to do it on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And the best way to actually do it is if you're doing offline distribution, you have to move along with your sales team at the back of a bike.
Okay.
And as the channels have evolved, so have we. I think there's a very nice omni-channel play available for brands right now, and I think brands have to decide which part of those channels would you like to play. And it's not necessary to play all the channels, but as organized retail has evolved, as e-commerce has evolved, there's a lot of opportunity in each of those.
Yeah.
And I think now we view each of those opportunities as very distinct opportunities. So for us, an online opportunity is very different from an offline opportunity. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we sell something online, it ever has to see the light of the day offline.
Interesting.
So we've actually segmented our portfolio in such a way that we have bets which we're taking only offline, and there are some bets which we're taking only online. And then even within those channels, there's a lot of differentiation because you've got Kirana stores, you've got modern retail stores, which are large hypermarkets. Some of those work on discounts. Some of those work on, a premium offering in terms of the gourmet experience that you have. Some of those work on convenience, that they're in your neighborhood, they're 1,000, 2,000 square foot stores. So the assortment going into each of these stores, to some degree, might be unique.
Yeah.
And if you're able to slice and dice that to make sure you're putting the right product at the right location, then you're able to optimize each of those opportunities.
Yeah, this is such an interesting insight because I was watching this episode with Amul's head and leadership team, and they were talking about how their protein offerings are only online. Yeah. And because, they know that customer profile will probably stack up those options. They'll buy 8 to 10 in one go instead of buying one at a time. So they will probably never make it available offline. But they will only promote these products online. So I'm hearing you echo the same thought where right product, right channel, right price. So talk about that optimization a little bit more, right? It might look like, to an outsider, it might look like, this is how you have to just make it work. But there's a lot of science involved behind that.
So, Shrishti, I think, the omni-channel opportunity is quite clear now in India, and I think there are very distinct channels one could operate in. And I think it again comes back to understanding which product fits in where. So especially the online channels actually are giving us a lot of opportunity to try novel concepts, especially concepts which are upscale, which are more premium, which are more functional in terms of nutrition, are ones which are seeing more traction online, or concepts which are more driven by convenience. So for example, there's rolled oats as a category, which is a slightly more premium version of oats where it cooks slower, it gives you a better release of energy, the glycemic index of rolled oats is better, it's also a little bit more palatable, the macros are pretty much the same, but that's a category that does significantly better online because the Gen Z consumer and the millennial consumer is looking for an upgrade over regular oats porridge. So I think we've realized that that's an e-commerce led opportunity, largely driven by Q-commerce and basket building e-commerce. And then you've got opportunities to create novel concepts. So for example, we launched trail mixes exclusively with one e-commerce player last year, which was a significant insight taken by what consumers are buying, what are their preferences, what sort of protein content would they like, what kind of dry fruits would they like. Very unique in terms of the offering. And the insight actually was that if a consumer is willing to ditch an 80 rupees a litre Tetra Pak milk for a 300 rupees a litre plant-based beverage, then they're looking for something better, right? These are obviously affluent consumers who want...
Because most of the almond milk and oat milk that you get here is not the best tasting.
Not great. And we had a personal experience with this. So I have 2 kids and both of them are dairy allergic. And when I looked around for vegan alternatives, I found very few. So we started making our own at home. And I realized that's...
That's what a lot of families end up doing, but it can't work in today's day and age.
And parents wanted convenience. People are choosing, plant-based dairy alternatives for sustainable reasons, for health reasons, because it helps, make you feel lighter. And I think there is a separate debate of dairy versus non-dairy, but it's a dietary requirement that's increasingly, evolving. Globally, it's become quite big, almost to a degree that I was having coffee with someone and I had regular milk and they said, do you even have regular milk anymore? So
Yeah.
it was, almost.
Yeah, I
insulting.
think the US is leapfrogs ahead. I
Yeah.
remember back when I was in university, I used to consume almond
Yeah.
milk back in the UK 10 years ago, 12 years ago, where, it
Yeah.
was so out there. But like in India, this revolution has just started, I
Yeah,
would say.
so we created almond milk, which was 70% more almonds than the market leader.
Right.
So, clear product advantage, chose the almonds very carefully in terms of sourcing. Then we created an oat milk, which we benchmarked to the top oat milk brands in the world and tried to get the same creaminess and texture. And oats and dry fruit were very close to, home for us because those are two ingredients that we understood well. I think this time getting them out in a beverage form was important.
How much time does the R&D process take for a new launch like this?
So for us, the R&D process typically is very quick. I think that's something which cannot, ideally take a lot of time in most cases, because in most cases we are very iterative with the R&D process. My father's been one of the chief innovators in the family.
Yeah, I was going to say, is he using his jugaad to figure out new
he
innovations?
is basically like the innovation driver, or now I would say he's the innovation motivator, where if you get in a product concept in front of him, he will actually draw out saying what the production line for this can actually look like in the same conversation.
Right.
And not have to research and get back. So it's become that intuitive for him, but that's also percolated down to the team. So many of these concepts where we've had products which interns have come back to us and said that I think this fits into the brand, we tried it, we said let's give it a shot. So it's not necessarily top down all the time.
Right.
Some of our new launches and new categories have actually been bottom up, which has been very insightful as well. And that's where our org structure is very flat. We have an office which has practically no chambers, and everyone is largely pretty open door. And I think that creates a culture where people are willing to share ideas, and we have the ability to take small risks, and if it works, then you can scale it up. So I think that's where channels segmentation, like trying things on e-commerce, definitely help. And then you've got this plant-based beverage where we created a very unique product. We created a milk called the oat and nut milk, where we blended oats and nuts in the right proportion to give you an experience which is as close as possible to cow's milk.
Right.
And the idea wasn't to match the flavor of cow's milk, but just make something that's honestly tasty and that you could drink as it is, because it's a huge acquired lifestyle, change. And we saw that with various consumers when we spoke. I think the only ceiling to making the switch was taste. People tried it and did not come back to the category. So we made that switch, and we didn't do much. We put it out there online, one platform, and organically we saw ratings go up. We saw that we were Amazon's choice in a short span of time without spending, any major shakes on marketing. And it was pure consumer feed and referral. And I think in today's time and age, brands have focused a lot on the first sell-in and looking cool and making sure that your product imagery is all nice, which it definitely should be. But I think repeat is so important, because that really differentiates between your first sell-in ability and how much you're eventually going to spend or burn on marketing over the years. And
I truly believe that repeat rates make or break a consumer business. That's the only thing I'm interested in evaluating when I'm looking at a consumer business.
And it's one of those things that we hold very dear. I think the only reason Bagrry's exists is because as a brand we've spent almost close to zero on marketing.
Zero on marketing?
Almost close to zero on marketing.
Yeah.
I would not say zero, but we focused a lot on making sure that we source the finest ingredients from around the world, put them into our cereal box in a manner that retains natural nutrition, and give it out to the consumers.
Yeah, but that is amazing to be able to do that as founders and promoters. I think nothing will give you better sleep at night than that.
Yeah.
But how does it impact your unit economics? Because ultimately if you're paying higher for your ingredients, then it is affecting your bottom line, right? So it's a trade-off.
That's true. And I think, to be fair, there is always money on the table. If you look at it, saying that if I choose A over B, then I can save that money on the table. So that's a short-term gain versus losing relevance long-term. So since we've been family-run, or maybe that's where values come in, saying that that's not something to touch. Sure, we can optimize that by making sure that we have sourcing which is long-term, lock-in contracts where there's visibility on these things. Especially post-COVID, the global supply chain on ingredients has moved around quite a bit. So one has to be very nimble with these things as well. But I think the ethos is to make sure that the product quality is intact. So that's one area of our COGS line item or our entire P&L line item which is non-negotiable.
Right.
We don't compromise on specifications, and I don't think in the foreseeable future we will. I think the intent is to really source good stuff, and because if you don't start with good stuff, the end product, no matter how good manufacturing setup you have, is not going to give you a great product. So I think that's really core to us.
Yeah, I want to dive a little deeper on the COVID implications that you spoke about, because at that time, manufacturing businesses, but in the categories that you were in, it was still safeguarded slightly. But I would say the supply chain was completely disrupted, right?
Yeah.
So talk about going through a crisis like that in a business environment where so much of your supply chain just gets disrupted overnight. How do you end up functioning?
So I think COVID for me personally was a great learning experience because around the time that COVID happened, my father, who was actively involved in the business, said, "This is your crisis to manage, and I've managed enough in life." And I think this is a crisis that's yours to manage. And fortunately, at Bagrry, we had a very experienced team, so it wasn't. Our team was honestly, doing most of the heavy lifting to make sure that stuff happened. And the supply chain piece was critical, like you said. So it was first about what all can you bring in, and then it was about what all can you sell to whom. And I think from that perspective, for the first few months, it was just simply, hustle. You did whatever you could to get ingredients or get your raw material in. You did whatever you could to sell product to the market. And at that point of time, it was almost like if you had anything, you had to ship it out, because also consumers needed food. It was not just about your business's sustenance, but also it was sustaining someone else at that point of time. And eventually, because it was an essential business, things started streamlining, and there's a lot of pivot of channel. So that's where we were already active on e-commerce. E-commerce was a channel which was doing fairly well for us. So we also chose, which are the channels where one has to prioritize. So we prioritized shops which we knew which were open, where there would not be hoarding. We prioritized e-commerce channels because we knew that they had the ability to deliver to consumers, and they were delivering in that environment. Our organized retail partners, and we chose a long-term bet. So in some cases, we also made sure that all our channel partners were equally made available with product. I'll talk more about that because we had a very interesting back-end support going, and I think a lot of our focus was also on employee well-being, because there was mental wellness, there was health at the forefront, and you had frontliners who were engaging with people, and I think we had created an entire setup to make sure that they're well taken care of in that sense, and I think that was a complete learning experience. In fact,
would you say that was your first crisis as a leader that you dealt with in the business?
I would say that was my first significant crisis. You could have had like small
of
crises, but I think for many of us, a crisis of that magnitude was, we'd gone through demonetization as a process where suddenly, and the Kirana ecosystem obviously was impacted by demonetization. We went through the implementation of GST.
How did demonetization affect your business? Because that time it must have been heavily cash dependent, your distributor network. So did it change things a lot?
So I think, to be honest, because as a business, at our level, we've been fairly digital and cash and carry. So for us, Bagrry's has been a cash and carry business, which means that our channel partners, put in the payment and then they get the stock. And we've been conservative in that sense that, even if it means that I can sell more on credit, let's be conservative and make sure that they wire in the money and then they get the stocks. I think that helped us a lot at a company level.
That's really good, because most brands don't do that, right? Or don't have the luxury to be able to.
So I think fortunately the business has been completely cashless, and we've had that philosophy that we'd rather scale gradually but have us sleep at night. So through these cyclical moments, I think that's really helped us overall as a business.
At least you were sorted on the foundational level. I think
that's great principles, and I really admire the fact that my father had the foresight to do it. And as
Is it because of the Marwari gene?
I think it's completely like a business sense. I
Yeah.
think there is a clear inherent understanding that do not sell anything which is at a trading loss.
Yeah.
Because long term that's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And in any measure that's not sustainable, and that's not doing business. That unit economics, you need to make sure that there is margin on the table, and margin on the table after you've accounted for all your overheads.
Yeah.
Not
It
just
can't be CM 1, 2, 3,
Yeah, so-
4.
so it took us a while to understand CM123s because
Yeah.
that was a new concept for
Yeah.
us. But and eventually when we started talking to consumer brands, it was a lot of learning to understand what these metrics actually meant. But I think the idea was that after accounting for all overheads, are you left with value on the table or not?
Yeah.
And does that value actually convert into cash? So I think those were two very clear metrics, and I think those are very fundamental to keep you through the bad times.
Yeah.
Because when times are good, when business is scaling, when there's a tailwind around your business, these things are often overlooked.
Yeah.
But it's when, say, you have a disruptive moment like COVID, when you have a disruptive moment like demonetization, is when these challenges happen.
Let's also talk about the consumer research part of it,
Yeah.
right? You were mentioning that you sit in on consumer calls. What does the consumer research process look like for you?
So actually, I think we're privileged to have some, senior people mentor us and tell us the importance of, stuff like quality research, because typically as a homegrown brand, most of us don't indulge in that. But I think it's very important that brands at some level understand what the consumers think of you, because there's one lens of what message you would want to say as a founder. And I think the other lesson is that, what do the consumers actually value in you as a brand, or what do they perceive you to be? And the message that you're trying to share as a founder versus the message that the consumers perceive of you can be very different.
Yeah.
So I think we were fortunate to actually run a few consumer researches to understand what consumers thought of Bagrry's, and that's where it came across that consumers largely perceive us to be an international brand, which is not a discount brand, but a premium over the category in some sense. They perceived us to be something which was more associated and more serious around the health and nutrition space. So some of the key values that we were trying to drive, and we also got insights of actionables where we needed to improve in terms of our messaging. Like many consumers did not know that we had muesli, but we also had a value-added cornflakes product.
Right.
Because their association or their engagement with the brand was either with our oats or with our muesli, so they did not know the range that we carry right now.
Yeah, I think for any founder, let's also talk about how to run this process really well, right? Because founders might not really have that understanding, because a lot of consumer brands today are launched by people who are in their 20s or 30s, who might not really understand how to run this process in a very good, optimized way. So what would you say are your core learnings from running this consumer research process?
So I think, honestly, it's not something that we're as deep on. There are obviously large organizations who do this day in, day out. And from that perspective, what I can say is, and I'll be paraphrasing, inspiration I had when I just joined the business, I went in and listened to a talk by Dr. Marewala, who for us is, one of the key examples of how do you build a successful FMCG business and then institutionalize it. So he used a word called quick and dirty market research.
Right.
So the idea wasn't to go deep into research and get everything perfect. It was to get those Pareto insights right, where you're able to get the big line items in terms of what consumers think of you, and do that research quick so that you're able to launch the product with the big key aspects, and then you can further refine it. And depending on what scale you're aspiring, see if you've got a large pool of capital, you want to really execute things from day one on scale, I would go heavy on research and do more qualitative research, speak to a lot of consumers, get as much, quant data as possible. If you feel your intent is to start something on a small scale and then scale it up, organically, then do the Pareto research, speak to consumers yourself, identify the needs, do quick A/B testing of what you're doing, and then just launch. And
is it true for the same new product launches versus an existing product that you might already be an established player in?
So I think there are two aspects to it. So one, if it's a new product launch, you're actually practically creating a category. So if
Yeah.
it's a category creation work, and that has also various levels. So one is if I'm creating a completely new form of consumption, that form of consumption didn't exist, then I think it's a lot of work to educate consumers. The least incremental innovation is that there's a category which is already doing well, and you create a product which is superior in that category, or which has your own pegs of innovation, or comes from your brand strength. And that's the easiest incremental in innovation. All of them have their pros and cons. The latter obviously is faster to introduce, but also chances are that you'd be in a very crowded environment already. The former is the most novel if you get right. I think there are fantastic examples in the CPG space of brands which have managed to do that. ID Fresh, I think, is a fantastic example of identifying a consumer need, creating an entire concept, taking something that was unorganized, putting it in organized. And I think that's been great inspirational work done in that sense. So those are avenues which pay long term dividends. Sure, brands will enter that space eventually, but you'll have that entire tailwind and understanding of having done that first. So I think as a young entrepreneur in the consumer space, you have to really identify what do you want to do. And which part of these pegs do you want to choose? Do you want to do completely disruptive stuff? Do you want to do incremental innovation? Do you want to do better for you stuff? And there are markets for all of this.
Yeah,
so I think
because I've seen some brands come up which are only focused on, say, making protein-rich stuff, right? Be it biscuits, bars, and all those sort of things. And then there's a whole different category which is trying to reinvent some of the existing categories, like chips and making them healthier, biscuits, making them healthier, those kind of things, right? So there are so many different plays that one can possibly choose. So when you are thinking about it, because now you're an established player who is also, competing with some giants, well, how are you thinking about this new product development? Like you took the example of beverage. It didn't exist as a category in India. So what went into the making?
So I think there are a few lenses when we look at NPI. So I think the sweet spot for us is that mass premium sweet spot. So we don't want to create products which are absolutely base of the pyramid, not because we don't want to, but right now our distribution reach is not there yet that, with a 5 rupee pack, I can enter each and every, small mom and pop outlet. And I really hope that one day we're able to get there. But it's also not to create products which are for that 0.1%, which are only in the top gourmet stores. And sure, we have offerings for those, but those offerings percolate beyond that. So the intent is to actually, the sweet spot would be a category like muesli, where it has the mass premium appeal, but yet it has the depth to be able to go into more than just the top stores in the country. And I think that's really the sweet spot for us. And now what we're doing is we're identifying opportunities of where opportunities exist in each of these sub-segments. So there's healthy snacking is a concept for us. Protein-based foods is a concept for us. Functional beverages is a concept that we're exploring deeper.
And when you're looking at these categories, are you thinking about broad terms like market size, what kind of penetration, like what are the metrics that you would
we look at market size, we look at we look at what channels do they go in. There are some novel concepts we have, but we're an ambient distribution business. So adding, say, cold chain might add complexity to a business, so that becomes a filter. So there are certain filters we have before choosing what to do. And I think one big functional filter also is the fact that at the end of the day, our stakeholders are our retail partners and category managers. They know us for certain categories. They may not know us for certain categories. So one big challenge that brands make when they launch multiple categories is they don't realize that if they go to an organized retailer, they'll have to talk to 5 category managers if they're in 5 categories. It'll not be one person. So that's 5 times the effort. It's 5 times the conviction. So it's better, in my personal view, to actually go deeper in one category, develop, yourself as a stakeholder in that category manager's ecosystem, as well as in that retailer's mind and the consumer's mind, and then enter other categories. But what we first did was actually make sure that we completed the entire gamut of breakfast. So we first had oats and muesli. Then we entered cornflakes, which is a very interesting story because my father was very clear he did not want to do regular cornflakes, and we got it right in our 3rd attempt. And
talk about that a little.
I would love to actually. It's a story where very early on we had oats and we had muesli, and then my father launched regular cornflakes, and then as a researcher he started speaking to food technologists and people in the industry, and then he realized that there is a very high glycemic index that exists for regular cornflakes, and it did not fit well with his product philosophy.
Right.
So he actually decided to shut it
Okay.
after launching it
Wow.
in the early 2000s, and said, I'll not do regular cornflakes under the Bagrry's brand. And then he tried to create his own innovation in cornflakes. So in 2011, we created a product called bran added cornflakes, which is bran coated onto the cornflakes to increase the fiber level of the cornflake. While the product was great, it didn't work because the brand sort of broke apart when you
His
added
focus
milk.
as a founder was to enhance the nutritional aspect.
Enhance the nutritive value.
Yeah.
He was extremely clear about
Yeah.
it, that I want to do something to make this category better for our consumers.
Yeah.
And then we tried again blending oats and cornflakes. And then in 2016, actually, we created a product which was a fiber fortified cornflake, which, the best to our knowledge, in a traditional cornflakes was done for the first time, where we infused fiber into the flake, where the look, taste, and feel of the product was the same as the regular cornflakes, but delivered 2 times the amount of fiber.
Wow.
So reducing the glycemic index, and we put in natural antioxidants instead of artificial antioxidants, which were better in terms of the health of the consumer. So I think the intent was to make that category better. So we first solved for the cornflakes challenge, that philosophically we should be able to do this. So there are many things that the law allows us to do, but as a brand we choose not to.
Yeah.
And I think those are philosophical guardrails that we have to work around. And then we entered into a very clean label kids product a few years later. So we first completed the entire gamut of breakfast cereals, and then we entered into several other categories in parallel. And I think there were many things that we tried which did not work, which were failures because they were way before time, but lots of lessons. We did a granola bar back in 1996, which we sold
Wow,
for a few years.
so ahead of its time.
We did brown rice in that time, where he mentioned that there was sourcing, which was a challenge. We created the first millet-based cereal in 2003. I think it was called 7 a.m. muesli, because we had 7 different grains going into the cereal. So I think we've been very open to experimentation, and we understand that some of these concepts might be ahead of its curve, but we'd rather be a little ahead of the curve than be laggards in that journey. So I think that we're very clear about. And I think in that sense, today it's a very thriving ecosystem of concepts. So I think very few brands would always be the first in trying a concept, and I don't even endorse that you should be, but I think you should have a lot of conviction around why you're doing it, and then be able to push for it. But there are opportunities offline, there are opportunities online.
Yeah.
I think.
What does your optimized channel look like in today's day and age?
So I think in today's day and age, you've got obviously an offline distribution, which one has to identify what is working. I think in our category, it's a lot of low unit packs, which is something that typically we're getting better at doing, but our strength has been large packs. I think we're getting more and more better at understanding, what the value is in low unit packs, as kids as a category does well there. There are the large organized retailers. So you've got, the Reliance, the D-Marts of the world, which are large organized play, which have the scale and which have the, purchasing ability. And that's where people like to buy, large quantities of product as well. There's a lot of value associated with those formats. And there we've actually created products where we've created a great offering at a good value. Some of our products for those channels are unique. So you have, say, our fruit and nut muesli, which I would say is our gold standard of a good fruit muesli, and then we have a nutty fruity muesli, which is a value offering in the same space.
Right.
Great product nutritionally, and actually tastes really good, but it goes to a different consumer.
Right.
So you have someone who values, say, a mass premium muesli also, and you have someone who values like a value muesli as well. So I think we've identified those sub-segments, and then there's the e-com space where there's a lot of new concepts emerging. So where most of our categories are products are actually different from what might be offline.
Yeah.
So, for example, we created a whey protein-based breakfast cereal, many years back, and we were the first in creating a whey protein-based breakfast cereal offering called a whey protein muesli, and that does significantly better online.
Right.
And we were having that chat where for many players the protein space does a lot better online, and I think we saw the traction offline as well. But in e-commerce, it's got much faster acceptance because you're able to describe the product a lot better. All the functional benefits are articulated well, and the consumers are also looking for such offerings in those platforms.
So has the distribution split changed over a period of time? Are the quick commerce, e-commerce players taking away from the large organized retail and smaller stores?
I think for us, e-commerce is becoming an increasing share of the pie.
Right.
I would say that the large organized players at an absolute level have been, fairly intact because, our GT distribution is still expanding. We're in over 70,000 outlets. Our aspirations to touch a lot more, but the intent is to actually create an e-com play where we're able to offer that health in 10 minutes kind of a proposition. So the kind of products we're selling are different.
Yeah.
Consumers are also looking for things that are more upscale, more convenient. The APCs are typically higher, and I think from that sense, there is an increasing amount of the proportion of business that goes online.
Yeah.
But I think most of the offline channels are also holding their own. So it's not like at an absolute level those businesses are, under pressure. But obviously, the growth levers of phenomena like Q-commerce, which are very fascinating and very novel to India, are here to stay. And I think we've been fortunate to be a part of that Q-commerce journey of having worked with these partners since inception. The pace, the ability to execute things quickly has been very motivating as well.
Yeah. And a lot of consumer brands even get as high as 30-40% of their revenue coming from quick commerce now compared to, the traditional brands. So is that also because you're not willingly spending on marketing that much, which is why, your quick commerce or e-commerce hasn't exponentially grown compared to organized?
So e-commerce for us has been a growth engine.
Yeah.
I think it's also because for a lot of brands, I think those categories, and I would say for startups, e-commerce is the go-to channel.
Yeah.
So there,
or the only channel that they can easily access.
And where once you enter, the barrier to entry is, just the first phase of entry is just about entering.
Yeah.
So I think from that perspective, for us, e-commerce has been growing quite rapidly. And I would say that, some of the Q-commerce platforms have been growing, significantly. And we measure various metrics to make sure that, we are out there in terms of the amount of, business we're doing. Is there repeat? You get live data, which is fantastic. So on a daily basis, you can, track if you've done a promotion, then how is it responding?
Yeah.
I think there's huge amount of data available to, make sure that you get those insights. There are regional level insights. So I think from that perspective, for us, our e-com team has actually now become a separate unit. So within our sales ecosystem, offline and online are clearly segmented.
Right.
Since the last few years, we've had separate leadership for the offline and the online teams.
Right.
And the online teams a lot younger. I think
they need to understand how content works.
They understand how content works. They understand what's working in terms of concepts. There's a lot of energy behind driving things. I think so. From that perspective, the online team's also willing to try new things. So our loop in that sense is a lot faster. If you're putting a product offline, we want to make sure that for a Kirana partner who's investing money behind holding the stock, it should actually, potentially rotate.
Yeah.
So I think the lenses are very different.
Yeah.
And in online, you have various marketing levers to make sure that you get consumers to try it.
Yeah.
So I think from that perspective, Q-commerce for our category as well as for many categories has been a bit of a rocket ship.
Yeah.
It's changed like the consumption landscape and even our habit as consumers. I think what we buy now.
Yeah, I end up ordering 3-4 times a day. Not sustainable, but that's the consumer behavior, right?
But that's how consumer behavior is evolving. And I think that's here to stay.
Yeah.
And I think the use cases are fantastic. So not just for food, not just for non-food. I think even in categories that one never thought
Yeah.
one would buy quickly. I think the use cases have been fantastic, and I think it's great work done in terms of execution. I think the speed
Yeah.
of executing that, executing, creating the backend infra, creating those platforms has been brilliant.
Yeah.
I would say, and it's been a huge inspirational learning curve for us. So as a brand, our role is to make sure that we are giving the relevant offerings.
Yeah. Let's also talk about, Aditya, how your father had the foresight to want to institutionalize the business. There are many things that you would have done differently compared to other family-run businesses. What would those things be?
So I think, in most family-run businesses, Shrishti, I think typically there's a challenge of, or a huge advantage, I'd say, in traditional businesses where there's a lot of family support.
Yeah.
So different family members wear different hats and so on, and that's very normal. And I think in our case, we were a very nuclear family, and I've seen that the challenge is that there are a limited number of family members available for that task. And more importantly, I think what my father also encouraged was to actually have an institution which lasts beyond our time. So the intent is that you're able to go the journey of what good family-run businesses in India have been able to do, and actually create platforms for consumer businesses where I believe we are at the starting point of maybe the journey that inspirational businesses like Marico or Dabur have taken.
Yeah.
And managed to professionalize those businesses. And I think there's a huge amount of merit in making sure that your business has an entrepreneurial rigor, but the executional bandwidth that a professional team brings on board, and it also brings on board a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
So I think for the first few years of me joining the family business, most of the team came from a legacy flambling business. The understanding of a consumer business was all of what they had seen in Bagrry's. This was the only journey they had taken.
Yeah.
So I think when we got in talent from outside, it got in so much fresh perspective.
Yeah.
And then blending that into a work environment which was new, I think
Was that culturally chaotic?
it was a very different experience because my prior stint was actually working for Goldman Sachs in the UK,
Right.
which was a very high energy, high performance, flat organizational structure. And then to come back and work in a family run environment is obviously extremely different. And I think for any second gen in the family business, the first years really make or break in making sure that you're able to navigate the cultural changes of what
Yeah.
you might have seen till you join the business.
And you also have to do a lot of soul searching, right? To find your place within the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah, and it's actually very fascinating because you come in thinking that you know nothing about this business and you're
Yeah.
here to learn.
Yeah.
And you're here to learn from the people who eventually you have to lead. And those folks are actually looking at you for direction from day one.
Yeah.
And to be very honest, there are many people who came in, asking for direction, and I said, hold on, I've just, come in, so I'm also
Yeah.
trying to figure out, how this business operates. And that's where I think the previous generation also has a role to play. And my father was extremely positive about making changes. In fact, he was making sure that, there's adoption of technology. He would nudge that, let's try and get new talent in. We need better infrastructure. For example, we got in, quality testing machines recently, which are X-ray machines, which have a zero ROI in terms of, giving any return on that capex. But they just make sure that in case there's a stone or there is some impurity that passes
Yeah.
through, then that is caught.
Wow.
So I think he has that foresight that I want my quality intact. So he would always invest in those things, and I think that ethos is sort of followed. And I think today we've got a good mix of young professionals joining the business. We still have a lot of folks who've actually joined the business many years back and who've moved up the ranks. So I think there's been stories of people who've started out as frontliners or office assistants and who've moved up the ranks to managerial roles. I think it's been very meritocratic in that sense. And as an organization, we are very clear about who we are and whom we are not. So, you can choose to, identify talent which is, more work-based, where their experience probably is more important than the degree that they carry.
Absolutely.
And while education's got a huge implication on someone's understanding and background, but we've also valued work experience a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about, financing the business, there are multiple ways you could have done that, right? But you chose to remain bootstrapped and profitable. Is IPO a potential financing that you would look at some point?
So I think, like I said, the intent is to scale this business up till a degree that, we can create an institution. So along the journey, if an IPO fits in, I think it's not the end goal. I
Yeah.
think for many consumer businesses, IPO becomes the end goal of value creation. If we're able to touch the right sort of scale and metrics, and the markets allow it, I'm sure it's one of those objectives we are looking at. But the idea is that it's a part of that institutionalizing process where we are able to create value for our stakeholders, for ourselves, and for the ecosystem, but more importantly go beyond that, and then it becomes an orbit of its own.
Yeah.
So the intent is that there should be a brand that lasts generations in whatever form it does, and whatever we execute should be able to do that. So financially, fortunately, we've had good basic unit economics. We've been bootstrapped. I think the intent is that as we scale for the next chapter, there'll be different avenues of effort required for brand building, effort required for distribution, for capex, and I think the team and the ability to execute today is more important. And capital today has become honestly more of a commodity where if you have the right execution ability, we've seen with the startup ecosystem that the capital really follows. So hopefully, that should not be as big a challenge as our ability to, execute our plans.
Well.
And that's really what we are focused on.
Yeah. I heard a very fun story that Bill Clinton's Secret Service team actually investigated your factory before he could eat your muesli. What's the story behind that?
So no, I think that's
That's
always a
version of it.
very interesting part of our journey. So we had Mr. Clinton visit us as president, and this was very early on when Bagrry's had launched a few years ago, and I think it was his first presidential visit, and our distributor got a call from Moria Shaitan that they wanted muesli because Mr. Clinton has muesli for breakfast, and he has a way that he has muesli, at least what we were told. So, pardon if there's any, paraphrasing or factual correctness, but he liked his muesli like overnight oats. So he would soak it overnight in yogurt and then have it the next day in the morning after having, frozen it, which is a very popular way of actually having cereal. So we sent out a bunch of our product, which was obviously security checked by the Secret Service team before, being served to him. But yeah, there was no factory inspection that happened. Yeah, I think that would.
Yeah, I think that becomes the media side of it.
Yeah.
Which what would you say as a consumer brand you've done differently in terms of marketing that without spending too much you've been able to build a presence in consumers' minds?
So I think 2-3 key things, if I would say. The first has been product, which I think we've spoken about. Make sure that the product is great. I think that's a starting point. You can obviously, market a product which may not be great, and there are great marketers who are able to, create almost that implicit attraction towards stuff. But I think our philosophy has been, let's make products that are great, that actually impact your life. If you're having something in the morning, or if you're having one of our products over a long-term period of time, it should make a net impact on you. And I think that's key to, driving repeat. So I think that's been one. Second is that can you find avenues to do things in a cost-efficient manner? It doesn't have to be the most glamorous route in terms of advertising. But if I give a few examples, then we actually were the first players to put breakfast cereal in a PET jar.
Right.
So one of the 90s innovations we had was actually put oats in a PET jar, and we used to traditionally sell oats in a tin, and which was a global way of selling oats. And then my father came up with the idea of putting breakfast cereal in a PET jar, and that changed the way people looked at oats, because suddenly homemakers got oats, but they also got a reusable PET jar.
Yeah, and we know how important that is in the Indian context.
So that was game changing in terms of consumption. And interestingly, when multinational entered the oats market, they actually introduced a PET jar in India, which they probably did for the first time in the world. So while we're a very small player in the overall scheme of things, I think this was an innovation that we brought to the to the breakfast cereal ecosystem, then we actually created a concept, partnered with some of the leading airlines a few years ago and created a concept which was a muesli on the go. So we pre-blended milk powder inside the muesli, and you had the option of pouring hot or cold water and stirring it, and the product was ready. And we launched it with an airline, and it was a limited,
Was it
period launch.
Indigo?
It was Indigo,
Yeah.
and it ran for a while, and it had its complications because it was a breakfast only product.
Yeah.
And their assortment did not carry, too many products for one meal in the day.
Yeah.
But that itself was very engaging, and consumers, had that option of eating something healthy on the first flight. So the idea was to solve for the consumer problem while offering something healthy. And I think today, to build a brand on digital, it's actually, far more scientific. You have a lot more data. You have several avenues in platform, outside platform. And, if I look at consumers today, then every product we sell is a subset of the smartphone consumer.
Yeah.
So there's a high amount of indexation that we have for spending money digitally vis-a-vis any other medium, because every consumer that buys Bagrys today potentially has a smartphone.
Yeah.
And hence, we are just identifying ways and means to engage with that consumer online, whether largely it's a part of a platform, whether you go into any of the e-com platforms or the q-com platforms, and getting consumers to, get to understand us better. And then it's obviously, content-based marketing, which is a completely new avenue of communication over the last few years. But I think content-led creation will be the future. It also needs to be a lot more relevant, that it's just not marketing for the heck of it, but where consumers see that this is actually genuine in terms of the
authentic brand voice at the end of the day.
Yeah. So I think that should resonate, and I think that's where content-based marketing is heading towards.
Yeah.
So I think consumers are also becoming discerning enough to understand that, okay, this is an endorsement, and this is what that influencer or that person genuinely believes. And I think that distinction is going to get more and more clear.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I let you go, my last and final question: as the hem, at the hem of operating this business, what are the key metrics that you look at? What are the important things that you are working towards in terms of improvement year on year?
So, there are obviously a set of metrics that one would look at. I think there are some daily metrics which include how much revenue you're generating, per day, or, on a monthly basis, what your product mix is looking at. If you, from a manufacturer's perspective, volume's obviously very important for you, because that's what runs your factories and so on. I think that's the high level daily operating metrics, and there are several metrics by product, by region, by category or channel that one would look at. And I think then there's the overall, financial metrics. So what's your profitability, looking like on a monthly basis? How profitable are your channels? What is your EBITDA looking like? What's your working capital employed? Because that's a metric most, businesses don't end up, looking at. But there are some channels which are very lucrative but might, guzzle up a lot of working capital as well. So I think that's one metric from a financial perspective we look at. Then there are strategic metrics in terms of, what's your growth rate within the subcategory? What's the subcategory growing at? Are you gaining share? Are you losing share? What's your spread in terms of the low cost offerings versus the the higher value offerings in the entire thing? How much of your business is getting generated out of NPIs? So these are all numeric metrics, and then every few years you do a qualitative dipstick to actually understand what consumers are thinking about your brand. Is your brand perception changing? And then you have external sources also. So I think the great thing with digital is that you get real time information on what your product movement's like, especially with the e-com retailers. We get much faster feedback as to if we did a promotion, then is that working or not. And I think the last part is eventually it's about the impact we're making on our consumer lives. So if you've done something new or with the existing product, I think that's a very qualitative metric, but we like to believe that we want to stay relevant. So the products that are generating revenue for us today are probably very different from the products that generated revenue for us 10 years ago. But the idea is that as the brand continues to evolve, I'm pretty sure that in the next 10 years, it may not be exactly the same set of products generating, the same share of revenue, but we'd want to be very relevant. So I think we keep tracking that, okay, this is what consumers are liking more. Maybe this concept is, not as relevant right now. So that's an avenue to work. So that's a qualitative lens. It comes after, much research. And then you also see, you know, stuff like movement, which products are rotating faster.
Yeah.
Is there expiry in the system? I think those things we have to be very, cognizant about. And I think that's just the basic consumer business metric. But there's a lot of information one can see.
I'm sure. Amazing. This was such a masterclass in for anyone who's building a consumer brand in India today. I think we've covered so many important aspects, be it product, distribution, channels. We've covered all of it. So thank you so much for spending so much time with me today and decoding business building for a lot of young people who are watching this show. Aditya, I really thank you for your time.
Shashi, thank you so much for having me here. I hope it's useful for your audience and viewers. And I'd say we're a very young brand in this journey in several ways, but I really hope some of our learnings, experiences are useful for whoever is viewing this. And thank you so much for having me. And all the best on your content journey.
Thank you.